All right, so we've talked a lot about Bitcoin. We've talked about how Bitcoin is valuable because it's useful and it's scarce. We've talked about how scarcity is necessary but not sufficient. Something can be scarce, but if it's not useful, it doesn't really matter. And we use the Dodge Neon as an example, which is far more scarce than Bitcoin, but not as valuable and not as useful for all kinds of reasons. And we talked about the problem that Bitcoin solves. And I won't say solves, but it does combat more effectively than existing systems, and that's the political determination of wealth, which is an increasingly important problem. You're seeing how everything is getting politicized, and wealth has always been politically determined, so that's not necessarily new. But there's always been various tools to oppose that, and Bitcoin's the next one off the line. I think it's an order of magnitude more effective at countering that. And the way it counters that is by removing the return on investment for regulatory capture. So we looked at how, hey, if Visa or MasterCard doesn't want to process a transaction, or if they want to process a transaction, but a judge says it's bad, the judge can just say, hey, Visa don't process it, Visa won't process it, and there you go. That's that. But with Bitcoin, because so many other people are processing transactions, and they're all incentivized to do so through personal profit, occasionally, potentially ideology as well. Even if one processor is leaned on in a certain jurisdiction and stops, it doesn't degrade the performance of the system as a whole. And competing jurisdictions will have competing incentives. Everybody processing has a profit incentive. The market itself, adjusts with something called difficulty. So if fewer people do it, it becomes more attractive to join, and if more people are doing it, it's potentially less attractive to join. So it does that through this process called mining. And that's how Bitcoin transactions are processed. Now, mining in Bitcoin is a proof of work system. And you've probably heard the term proof of work, at least in crypto speak. You've also certainly been familiar with the concept of proof of work, even if you haven't called it that, through other normal life activities. So proof of work is everywhere, especially in human activities. If you look at a musician, well, first let's talk about it. So proof of work, I mean, from the Bitcoin terminology, being able to prove something immediately, even if it took lots of work to complete. Now, with human interaction, that would be something like you watch somebody who's, say, a virtuoso on the violin. You can see them play one song, and you immediately know, like, wow, that person put in thousands of hours of practice. If you watch a professional athlete, it's the same thing. You could see a work of art. Maybe not anything produced in the last 80 years, but if you look at anything from the Grand Masters or a painting, you can say, wow, a serious craftsman worked on this. Not only that, but he probably had to learn from somebody who learned from somebody who learned from somebody, generations of input, and some of the skill required. And that you can see that just by glancing at something, like a drawing. There's the famous but potentially apocryphal story of the artist Giotto, Italian Renaissance painter. The Pope sent him a message, or supposedly said, hey, prove your skill to me, and he just drew a perfect circle and sent it back. And the Pope was immediately, wow, proof of work. This guy's an expert. And that's an interesting one because it's almost a computer sciencey answer, right? Like, what's the simplest, least sexy way that you can prove expertise? For Giotto, it's just drawing a circle. For Bitcoin, it's solving a math problem. And I hate that expression. You've probably heard so many random, terrible Bitcoin explanations being like, oh, it's this contest to solve a math problem. And then, and it's a totally useless and very, very disappointing explanation. So it's best explained in the video I linked in the last one. And I'll link it again, too, because I think you really need some infographics and a certain technical appetite to get through it well. But I'll go ahead and dive in and verbally explain to the best of my ability here on a one-take boat Bitcoin ramble. I would recommend, really, stop watching the video right now, go get some Bitcoin, maybe read some articles, check out the other one, or you're free to just listen to me talk about this and see what mistakes I make. If you call me out for anything in the comments, I will send you some money, so there is that to look forward to. Proof of work in Bitcoin. So instead of, seeing a drawing and being like, wow, that was an expert and not a 3-year-old, with Bitcoin, you are seeing the result of a calculation. And that calculation is something called a hash function. So a hash function takes an input, puts it through a function such that the output is random and you can't back calculate to the input. For example, you could take, say, a JPEG file, right? Anything digital is just a string of ones and zeros. You can take a file, which can be a movie or a picture or a book or an essay or a contract or a PDF or anything, and you put it through this function, and your output's going to be a totally random string such that you can't determine what the input was from the output unless you guess and check. And that's what computer science proof of work is guessing and checking, right? So you can put, let's say, a JPEG through this hash function, and you just get the hash, and somebody could see the hash and have no idea what went in, but then if they go through, you have a library of, say, you have 10 JPEGs or whatever, and put them all through, one of them produces that, they'd say, aha, like that was the input, there's the output. Now, hash functions have all sorts of applications in encryption and computer science. One of the novel applications they have is in cryptocurrency, where you say, hey, what if, instead of like Visa processes transactions, they just send it to a server and Visa does it. What if anybody can process transactions? And what if, to process these transactions, we batch them? We said, we'll collect however many transactions are in the network in an arbitrary period of time, and then we will also include some other data with that, and we'll also include some sort of proof of work, something that shows that real computer resources were used to process these transactions in the competitive environment of Bitcoin mining. What if we could do that? So the way that happens with Bitcoin, you take all of these batch transactions, and now that's the input to this hash function, the block, along with some other information, and you try to hash it in such a way that the resulting answer has a certain amount of leading zeros at the beginning of it. Now, if you only need one leading zero, you don't have to change that much. You can just keep guessing and checking. You have all the transactions, and you're iterating a number, and you keep iterating that number until bingo, you find a block where the hash of all that information gives you the amount of leading zeros that the network currently requires. And once that's broadcast, any other computer on the network can immediately repeat that calculation and say, yep, like that was valid, that works on the rules, like a certain amount of computing resources had to be used to find that solution. And they'll start working on the next block. One of the things that gets included in that hash is information from the previous block. So that's why you have this thing called a blockchain, is that each block gets related to the next one, and hash. So you can't just undo, say, like one transaction. And the further back in time you go, the more you'd have to undo and the more work it would take to do it. It becomes this incentives game. So people could mess with the Bitcoin blockchain, but if the cost of doing it is greater than any potential ROI of doing it, then what's going to happen? And that's really what's securing the Bitcoin network is incentives. It's incentives driven. There's not a reason why humans can't stop doing anything that humans do. Why all the miners might just turn off their miners tomorrow. Just they don't have an incentive to do that. They have an incentive to keep going for profit and potentially, some ideological motives as well. So that gets you your Bitcoin block. The other thing that comes from the block is issuing new Bitcoin. So an arbitrary decision Satoshi had to make when he first designed the system is like, well, how do I issue it? And said, well, what if we issue it as part of the incentive for processing these transactions? So every time one of these blocks is found, we'll also include newly issued Bitcoins. So the first block, issue 50. 50 Bitcoins issued every block. And let's do that for 210,000 blocks, and then we'll half that to 12.5. And then every 210,000 blocks, we'll just keep halving it. Now, in human terms, that works out to about every 4 years, 210,000 blocks. So we've had the reward half. The first one was in 2012, next one in 2016, the next one's estimated to be in 2020. And because Bitcoin has 8 decimal places, if you just keep extrapolating that out, starting with 50 per block, having it every 210,000 blocks, eventually, when the reward is less than the smallest unit of Bitcoin you have anymore, you're left with a supply of 21 million. So that's also just its own arbitrary distinction. That's where that number comes from. That's pretty cool. Halvening every 210,000 blocks. So we start with 50 and we get 21 million. Maybe there were some other mystical reasons he chose that. It doesn't really matter. It's just an arbitrary choice. We could talk about difficulty for many videos, but for now, let's just say it's the number of leading zeros you need, right? So if you say, hey, I want these blocks to take 10 minutes, and you have this many computers trying to solve the problem, well, the more computers you add, the faster they're going to solve the problem. So eventually you'll need to make that problem harder so that it always takes about 10 minutes and that it remains this competitive market. Now, there's all sorts of interesting algorithms and like how you decide that and like what's going on, but I think that's beyond the scope of any sort of what is Bitcoin video. Really with that, I think I'll just stop talking. High level explanation. Any really big mistakes, let me know in the comments. Leave an address, I'll send you some cash. And go use it. Like I said in the last video, that's really the best way to learn. I remember being so frustrated to go to meetups, and there's some people who don't know anything, and they're like, oh, it's this crazy math problem contest, and it's like they're worshiping it instead of it being this computer science thing. And then there were some people who I found even more frustrating. They're like, just in a couple of years you'll get it, and that's also, nobody wants to hear that, right? It's like, hey, no, how do I get it now? I want to learn. But to a certain extent, there is a bit of your own proof of work and practical experience that goes into it. You'd be surprised once a portion of your net worth is in something like Bitcoin. You'd be surprised at how fast you figure it out and you understand it and how important that becomes. Not that I'm advocating anybody do that. However, some practical experience really can't be beat. So maybe just get $5.